Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Alan Wallace. Alan is a highly respected meditation teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and is a leading voice in discussions on the relationship between science and Buddhist philosophy. In 1971, he moved to India to study Tibetan Buddhism, medicine and language. While in India, he was ordained by the Dalai Lama and spent 14 years as a monk, where he studied with and translated for several highly respected lamas. In 1984, he studied physics at Amherst College and went on to gain a PhD from Stanford on the interface between Buddhism and Western science. Since 1987, he has been a frequent translator and contributor to meetings between the Dalai Lama and prominent scientists, and he has written and translated more than 40 books. He is the founder and director of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies and of the Center for Contemplative Research in Crestone, Colorado. Today we speak about the contemplative approach to studying the mind, as well as the Dzogchen teachings on the nature of consciousness in Tibetan Buddhism that have been very important to both of us. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Alan Wallace. Alan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to join you.
So I think we both came to an interest in Buddhism through the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation I've heard you speak about. Is that right, that was the text that kind of got you on this path?
And you as well?
Yeah. It was the first book I read that really resonated with my personal experience.
That's remarkable. Yes, I first encountered it in 1970.
And were you backpacking, I understand, in Europe, and it just resonated with you?
Exactly, yeah. I picked it up in a youth hostel in Switzerland. Somebody left it behind. And I just, as I was reading through it, as I was hitchhiking up through Europe, up to Scandinavia, to Norway, it really just resonated. And that kind of hooked me, yeah.
And then maybe you could tell everyone a bit about your background, because you've had a very kind of impressive resume of years training with many wonderful teachers.
Yes, I'm quite old, so I have a long resume. Sure. So my undergraduate days back in the late 60s were spent at the University of California, where I was studying biology, planning to become an ecologist, a wildlife biologist, environmentalist. That was the one thing I could really deeply and thoroughly believe in. And I still do. But it was on that hitchhiking trip, not backpacking, but really hitchhiking around Europe during the summer of 1970, that I just found myself asking deeper questions. Because even back then, it was clear, population biologists like Paul Ehrlich and others, the Silent Spring, they were already recognizing the very detrimental ways that we as a human species are impacting the environment. And it turns out, even back in the 1960s, astute scientists were already aware that global climate change would be a problem that was human-made. And so I encountered Buddhism, but it was coming out of kind of a deeper set of questions. Simply put, I like to keep my responses fairly concise, is that why do we so often, we human species, collectively and individually, why do we so often act contrary to our own best interests? Because we've known about global climate change, we've known about the pollution, the violation of the environment with many types of contaminants. We've known about global climate change for a long, long time. And yet people, including my homeland America, we still vote into office, into positions of tremendous power, people who denies even a problem, which is, frankly, it's sheer idiocy. And I think people have a right to be idiots, there's all kinds, but they shouldn't be in positions of power. But it's in a democratic country like the United States, like the UK and so forth, we are the people that put them into power. And we are the people who refuse to take the short-term sacrifices in order for the long-term benefits for ourselves, for future generations. Why don't we take full use of the marvelous and extensive scientific knowledge we have and the technological responses and remedies for the problems we are creating? Because we don't actually need more science or more technology to overcome and counteract all the damage we're doing. So people that believe, well, just give us more science and technology, I would say, well, I'm always happy for more science and technology, but we're not making use of what we already have. And why is that? And then we turn to Buddhism. We can turn anywhere we like, but that's where I found my interests were going. And we see these, very clear explication of the root of mental suffering. And that is, one, it's ignorance and delusion. Ignorance of just not knowing what's going on, and delusion of getting it wrong. And then the attachment, the craving, the greed, the short-sighted self-centeredness of wanting short-term gain, and then the hostility, hatred, violence, and so forth when anything gets in our way. And I looked at that threefold, kind of the three poisons you're probably familiar with, and I thought, wow, that has far more explanatory power than Newton's three laws for, mechanics, or for James Clerk Maxwell's four equations describing electromagnetism. Those are fantastic natural, laws that were discovered by great brilliance and mathematical prowess. But in terms of understanding the roots of suffering and how we human beings perpetuate our own suffering and that of many other species on the planet, I've never found anything so brilliant with such tremendous explanatory power as all of the afflictions and all of the evil that we human beings, and I do very much include myself, all of the destruction we bring to the world can be explained. And that is, we don't know and we get it wrong. Craving, attachment, greed, clinging to things outside as if they'll finally give it the satisfaction we're looking for, and they never do. And then hostility, aggression, and so forth, whenever we get something we don't want, or prevent us from getting something we do want. And that works equally on an individual level, as well as national, international, business, politics, and everywhere. And I thought, wow, that's a deep, deep diagnosis. And of course, the Buddha was not just saying there's a problem and good luck, everybody, but then said, look, there's the problem. And what can we do about this? How can we remove and possibly completely eradicate these fundamental afflictions of the mind, or toxins of the mind, that give rise to all harmful and destructive behavior that human beings ever engage in? So it's a very powerful explanatory theory that, again, is not religion. It's not even philosophy as something simply logical. It's something that can be put to the test of experience. So that really hooked me, and I've been hooked for the last 50 years by now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight, that from the maybe Western perspective that's used to problem solving of symptoms, it may seem strange that understanding the nature of the mind is if you chase any particular problem down, you come back to the mind. You come back to, if you understand it, then you understand what's going on, and it totally makes sense as to why once you start on this path of exploring it and trying to master it, it totally makes sense as to why you would want to do that, right? And you've been a great defender of arguing for the role of introspection, like that it should take a kind of have a more high profile role in our understanding of the mind. It's kind of been comparatively neglected in the West, right?
It has been for the last 110 years. But one of my great heroes, among the great pioneers of modern psychology, the scientific and experimental study of the mind, was William James. And he, together with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, and the English psychologist Edward Tishner, who emigrated to America, took a very leading position at Cornell University. These were some of the great shining lights, the luminaries, for the first 35 years of modern psychological study of the mind. And they all advocated a truly scientific approach to the mind. And William James actually wrote an article, A Plea for Psychology as a Natural Science. And if you look at all of the other natural sciences, biology, zoology, cosmology, you name it, all of the other fields of natural science, going back to the time of Galileo, have had as the primary mode of inquiry the direct, sophisticated, rigorous, and replicable observation, experimentation, investigation of the phenomena they're seeking to understand. So if you want to understand plants, you look at plants. If you want to understand the planets, you don't go to astrology, you don't go to astrological charts, you actually look at the planets. And that's what Galileo did and started the revolution in the natural sciences altogether. And so I'll take William James as the spokesman for that first 35 years or so of modern psychology. And he said, first, foremost, and always, we should rely upon introspection to understand the mind, because this is the truly scientific approach. Observe carefully that which you wish to understand as in a branch of science. Whereas if all you're willing to study because of the metaphysical constraints of materialism, ideological constraints, if it's not material, it doesn't matter, literally. And the only way to study something is by looking outwards to the objective, third person, and quantifiable. That, in fact, from the time of James Watson, the founder, at least one of the great founders of modern behaviorism, they basically kowtowed to the beliefs of materialism and threw off the empiricism of the natural sciences, all branches of natural science up to that point. And he said, never mind introspection. In fact, we won't speak about subjective experience, and introspection will have no role. So that was the collapse. That was the collapse of a truly empirical study of the mind. And they supplanted that by looking at the behavioral expressions of the mind, which is all very well, but it's not looking at the mind. And then from the 1960s and so, the birth of the modern academic discipline of neuroscience, then they studied the neural correlates of the mind. But the fact that two things are correlated, not by any stretch of any logic, does it mean that if two things are correlated, they must be the same thing. Or that one thing in a very straightforward and simplistic fashion causes the other. Like a light switch. I'm looking at a light switch right now across the room. And if I went over there as a scientist, say, wow, what is that little button there? And I push it and I see the light goes on. I push it again, the light goes off. Wow, there's a correlation. And it's a direct correlation, up, down, on, and off. Wow. So that therefore, light must be a function of the light switch. Well, that's crazy. Or light actually must be located in the light switch. After all, they're correlated. But that's just crazy. And that's exactly the kind of craziness that's dominating the mind sciences for the last 110 years. If there's a correlation, the brain must be the sole cause of it. And all mental functions, dreams, emotions, desires, must be inside chemicals. And if there was ever a categorical error in the history of science, that's the zaniest, thinking that dreams exist inside synapses and neurons, chemicals, and so forth. It's a loony idea. But for the true believers in materialism, they're compelled to believe that. Otherwise, they would have to acknowledge that there are non-physical things in the universe. And this is a fundamental article of faith. And it is faith and not science that the only things that exist are the physical, matter, energy, and emergent properties. And they will hold to that to their dying breath. And so as Max Planck, the founder of modern quantum mechanics said, and I paraphrase but very closely, such people who are such true believers, like religious fundamentalists, you can throw all the evidence at them and it won't have an impact. You can throw reasoning and logic at them and it will have no impact, just like religious fundamentalists. And so Max Planck said, it doesn't help to try to defeat them with logic. You just have to wait for them to die. That science progresses funeral by funeral. And this is not a death wish, it's just a fact. The old guard that have made their whole reputations and earned all their awards and accolades and so forth, all rooted in the unquestioned belief of materialism. They would have to sabotage their entire career and say, hey, mea culpa, I made a big mistake when I was 20. And they're not going to do that. And so they're just going to retire. And then we'll see people of your generation and even younger coming in and said, hey, we don't really care for those shackles that you put yourself on. And there's a lot more to reality than what fits into the human construct, the category of the physical. So get real. The universe is not anthropocentric. The whole universe doesn't fit into a conceptual construct made by human beings in the 20th and 21st century. It's so parochial. It's kind of a joke. But when a lot of people believe in a joke, then it's taken seriously by a lot of people, the same ones.
Yeah, I think that's it's strange that the actual, when you look into kind of, what the kind of worldview of science really is versus what people in science say, there's a complete disconnect. And I think for a lot of us, who defend the synthesis of science and spirituality, this is what we point to, is that you have the reality of conscious lived experience, and that comes first really in our, for us, like this is it, like, and then if you're so inclined and you enjoy the game of mapping out the laws of nature, great, you can go and do that, but never forget that it's a map of the real thing is the lived conscious experience. And if you're going to get so infatuated with the map that you think only the map exists, and you thought you were in love with your partner, but actually you're not, it's because the map tells me it's all this meaningless, empty stuff. That's just, again, as you say, I mean, that's just kind of it's a kind of mistaken thinking. Science actually doesn't say that. Science just says it's a map. It doesn't say that love is just a chemical reaction in the brain. That's a kind of story told by people who maybe don't feel as comfortable talking about the kind of spiritual side of things. So you mentioned quantum mechanics there, and I heard a great talk from you. You spoke about that you took part in these meetings between physicists and the Dalai Lama, and there seemed to be kind of converging on maybe the concept of emptiness in Buddhism, and there being kind of a parallel in quantum mechanics. Is that something you'd be able to kind of lay out for people?
Sure. Why don't I just preface that by a very, very condensed version of what's happened to my life since 1970, when
Yeah.
I picked up this book on the Tibetan Book of Liberation. I spent a year studying in Göttingen, but I just decided to drop all my other studies. I found what really had meaning for me. Started studying Tibetan language in Göttingen, and then spent the next 14 years or so, total immersion in, I went to India, took ordination as a monk by the Dalai Lama, lived with Tibetans for about 14 years, spent years in meditative retreat. And then in 1984, I decided maybe it was time for me to start integrating my Western life with my Buddhist life, because they're very, very different worlds. And so I matriculated at the age of 34, having just 2 years or 2.5 years of university under my belt. I matriculated at Amherst College, a marvelous undergraduate college in New England, and studied physics, the history of science, philosophy of science, mathematics, studied Sanskrit. It was a marvelous 2.5 years. Then took off a couple of years to go back into meditative retreat again, and then spent 6 years at Stanford University, studying, it was in religious studies, but took a lot of philosophy of physics, of biology, philosophy of mind, and so on. Got my doctorate there, taught for 4 years at the University of California, Santa Barbara in religious studies. And then ever since then I've been really focusing on the integration of especially physics, because that's where my background is. I've written, maybe 3 books on physics and consciousness and so on, and have participated in the Mind and Life conferences since they began in 1989, or was it 87? 87 it was, 1987. I was one of the founding members. And so I've been involved with them for a long, long time, not recently, because I'm kind of doing my own thing, a bit different trajectory. But it was about 1997, and I think I was probably one of the influences for it, because I was on the board of Mind and Life Institute for many, many years, that we invited a group of first-rate scientists, physicists, including my mentor in physics, under whom I studied at Amherst College, Professor Arthur Zients, who remains a very dear friend. And he put together just an outstanding group of about 5 physicists. And in 1997, we met with the Dalai Lama. I was serving as co-interpreter, together with his primary interpreter, a marvelous Tibetan scholar named Tutin Jimba. And it was just a fantastic meeting of mind. That's when I can say 5 days, 5 hours a day. And I'll just tell one anecdote from that. One of the world-class physicists who was invited to this meeting was the Austrian quantum physicist, Zeilinger. I'm looking for his first name. Do you remember it?
Anton
Zeilinger, yeah. World class. He'd done groundbreaking work in experimental quantum mechanics. He was the first one to achieve quantum teleportation. I won't elaborate. But Anton Zeilinger was then he had 2.5 hours to present to the Dalai Lama. And he was describing how in quantum mechanics, if you're really looking for the nature of any elementary particle, whether it's a photon, electron, whatever, as it exists from its own side, independent of the system of measurement, you never find it. And so he was giving this very profound and utterly empirically based explanation of the fundamentals of quantum mechanics. And he got well into his presentation, and the Dalai Lama said, I was interpreting for him, he said, how could you possibly know about this? That these elementary particles don't exist from their own side, independent of observation. How could you know about this without knowing Madhyamaka philosophy, the middle way philosophy of Nagarjuna and so on? And Anton Zeilinger, being this marvelously open-minded man, a true empiricist, he turned to the Dalai Lama and said, what's that? Because he accepted the invitation to come to this 5-day meeting with the Dalai Lama, not because he was really interested in Buddhism, let alone had he studied it, he hadn't, but with an open mind, willing to learn something new. And so he didn't know anything about Madhyamaka, or middle way view, the view that all phenomena are empty of inherent nature. And so then the Dalai Lama gave a brilliant, truly a brilliant encapsulation of this middle way view that all phenomena are empty of their own intrinsic existence as a Ding an sich, if we use the Kantian terminology, but they do arise in a mode of interdependent origination. They're interdependent, but empty of their own intrinsic identity. And then Anton Zeilinger said, how could you possibly know that? How could you have come to those conclusions without knowing quantum mechanics? And so it's this wonderful meeting of minds. And then Anton, I just have to finish the last part of the anecdote, because he was coming to this conclusion really based on just experiment after experiment after experiment. He was and is a philosophically astute man. He had a classic education in Austria, but it's experiment-based, his conclusions. Whereas the Dalai Lama is coming from the contemplative tradition, where meditators are focusing in on the nature of mind, nature of emptiness, realizing emptiness, but also using logic for sure. And so then Anton, he wanted to really show to the Dalai Lama how he had come to his conclusion, because it certainly was not by the same route that the Dalai Lama and Buddhists for the last 2,000 years have been coming. And he said, would you be willing to come to my laboratory? And back then he had his own laboratory at the University of Innsbruck. Will you be willing to come soon to my laboratory, and I will show you the experiments on the basis of which we draw these conclusions. And the Dalai Lama took maybe 3 seconds to decide. He turned to his personal secretary, said, make it happen. So the next year we all showed up in Innsbruck. And so the saga goes on, so I won't elaborate. But it really, this kind of open-minded is absolutely from the Dalai Lama side, and not from all scientists any more than all Buddhists are open-minded. I wish that were the case, but it's not true. But I've encountered enough truly open-minded and first-rate scientists that are eager to question their own assumptions and to learn new, including from non-materialistic paradigms and non-materialistic methodologies, that this is giving rise to more and more very fruitful and, how do you say, cross-pollinating types of dialogue. So it's been quite thrilling, actually, and I've been truly a great privilege to be part of this, kind of from its inception, because I think this was the first meeting of first-rate scientists way back in 1987 that has occurred between first-rate Buddhists and first-rate scientists. So
yeah, that's a wonderful thing to be in the room for. Do you think, so with this Madhyamaka view of things not having their own separate independent existence, but rather everything being kind of dependent on everything else, you mentioned that your initial interest was ecology. Do you see a parallel there? Because to me, it seems like, in the same way a flower doesn't exist as a flower without insects to kind of be attracted to the bright colors and carry the pollen. And suddenly you can see that it's an illusion to say that flowers have their own independent existence is only really a play of interdependent origination.
That's a very, very powerful parallel. And of course, it has occurred to me many times that among all the branches of the natural sciences, I think it's fair to say that ecology is the one that focuses most on interdependence. And that is, you can't take one species and treat it in isolation. You can't take the soil and treat it in isolation from the air. You can't take one continent. That is, if we look at the planet, from outer space, which we've all seen, you'll notice that there aren't any boundaries. There are oceans between land masses, but there's no boundary between England and Scotland, for example, or between Russia and the Ukraine. Those are all made up. And so from nature's side, there are no boundaries. And so ecology is really perhaps the most encompassing of all the branches of science, because it has to include physics. You can't leave that out. You can't leave out chemistry. That would be ridiculous. You can't leave out biology. That's right. Biology is right at the core. But then, all the other branches of knowledge that pertain to this globe. You could leave out the moon and sun. They probably don't have a whole lot of, we can't influence them. But yeah, it's focusing very much on interdependence. And the fact that, I'll just give one example. In Yellowstone National Park, in the Rocky Mountains in the United States, they killed off the wolves a long time ago. The ranchers, they didn't want them eating their sheep and their cattle. They wiped them all out. But then they decided, the biologists, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, decided to reintroduce wolves back into their natural habitat, because up in Canada, they hadn't been wiped out. And lo and behold, just by introducing some wolves into their native habitat in Yellowstone National Park, they found this had an impact on the streams, on elk, on many, many aspects, that one insertion then brought many other aspects of that natural habitat back into balance, right? And so likewise, if you poison one thing, if you wipe out one species or introduce one poison like DDT into the ecosphere, you're not just poisoning what you wanted to poison. That poison creeps out. And so it is really like a biological law of karma. And I'm not going metaphysical here or ooey gooey. I'm just saying that laws of karma are all about interdependence of the interrelationship between subjects and the objective world. That's what ecology is about. That we human beings cannot regard ourselves as a unique, isolated, independent species, because we can't exist independent of the other species or the ecosphere we're influenced by and we are influencing. And we can do so in very beneficial, benevolent ways. Or we can follow our current trajectory, which is a trajectory of self-destruction and destruction of the ecosphere.
And so you mentioned the fact that there are no kind of, there is no kind of objective boundary between Scotland and England or any other countries, and we kind of mentally impose these boundaries. One of the things I study in my scientific research is how the mind and the brain kind of creates these artificial boundaries, how consciousness gets divided up. How is it right now that I'm got a conceptual category that says that some certain things are your voice, certain things are my voice, and it structures consciousness in that way. But my interest in that came out of these kinds of states of awareness that are described in, especially well in Tibetan Buddhism, of the kind of the deep nature of consciousness, that it is fundamentally undivided, right, and non-conceptual. Yeah. And I think maybe this term Rigpa in Tibetan Buddhism might refer to this. Is that something you could expand upon?
Yeah. As you probably know, in the history of Western science, which let's say began with Galileo, it's a pretty good starting point. It was 300 years before the scientific study of the mind even began. It was widely assumed, going way back to Thales and the early Ionian thinkers in Greece, that they could study the objective universe and just leave out the mind as if it had no significance, had no impact, was irrelevant. And when I studied cosmology, among many other branches of physics, when I was at Amherst College, I read one cosmology text after another, and I found they all had something in common, many things in common, of course, but one of them was they made no references to consciousness, no references to the mind. And this is quite endemic for Western Eurocentric civilization altogether. You notice that we have Nobel Prizes in a wide variety of branches of science, physics, chemistry, and so forth. Have you noticed that there's no Nobel Prize given for psychology?
When I was an undergrad in psychology, Daniel Kahneman had won the Nobel Prize for his work, and the lecture we were told about that we were told his Nobel Prize was economics, because it was kind of behavioral economics, right, even though he was a psychologist, right? So yeah, you're very right.
It'll either be like Pavlov, it'll either be in biology or in economics. The human mind, there's nothing in nature more important than mind, for us human species anyway. And yet it's not significant enough to have a Nobel Prize for it. And so the mind has been marginalized in Western science since Galileo, right up to the rise of modern psychology. It had about a 35-year breathing spell of actually looking at the mind, and then they shut that down, and it's been almost entirely supplanted by behaviorism, neuroscience, and cognitive psychology, but which is all looking outwards. And so when we go to Tibet and its culture, its Buddhist culture that goes back about 1,200 years, rooted in another 1,200 years or so of Indian Buddhist culture. And again, the first universities in the world were not by the Muslims. It was not the University of Bologna or Sorbonne or Oxford or Cambridge. Centuries and centuries before, many centuries before, there were already great universities. Takashila, which is the time of the Buddha, and Nalanda, it arose and was on a decline before any of the Western universities ever even came into existence. And these were universities. But the difference between these multiple universities in Indian culture, classical Indian culture, was for all of them, the central topic of study was the mind. It was called Adhyatma Vidya, the knowledge of the inner world, the inner knowledge of the mind. And of course, India, like China, like Europe, like South America, they had, statistically speaking, they had to have their fair share of geniuses. Genius was not all European, despite many European histories that would suggest, yeah, we got all of them, and the rest people are, savages and uncivilized. And so if we simply consider the biological fact that 5,000 years of civilization in India produced a corresponding number of geniuses as Europe, which doesn't have a 5,000-year history of civilization, much shorter than that, they've made many, many discoveries that have been replicated and for which there are manifest benefits. And they have to do with multiple dimensions of the mind. And so modern psychology really doesn't go any further than the subconscious, or some people take seriously and many do not. Jung's collective unconscious, but it's hard to test scientifically. Looks more like, speculation. True or not, it doesn't have empirical evidence, compelling empirical evidence behind it. And so I have never really given up my passion for science, for empiricism, for having hypotheses you can put to the test with experience and either confirm them or and be done, you know, throw out the garbage. And so the short answer to your question after a long prelude is, to my mind, there's just no doubt, starting with the Buddha himself, but not starting with him. Centuries before them, these great Indian yogis, swamis, rishis, and so forth, had already turned into a fine art, or one could say a fine technology, the development of samadhi. Not the Chinese, not the Hebrews, not the Greeks or Romans, not the Mayans, the development of highly refined, highly focused, high energy flow of consciousness, of meditative concentration. India gets the kudos for that. They developed it, it spread to China, to Tibet, Southeast Asia, and so forth. Whereas we in the West, we're still struggling with ADHD, you know, and we're treating with Adderall and Ritalin. We're treating it, you know, instead of actually getting to the underlying causes of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, like every other psychological disorder, when put into the hands of the pharmaceutical industry, we're just suppressing the symptoms. With the full support of the scientific community, the whole field is anesthesiology. Why in America it's called the National Institute of Mental Health, it should be called the National Institute of Mental Anesthesiology, because almost all the funding goes to drugs, and there's not even one that cures a single mental disease. They only suppress symptoms, which means they're treating the symptoms and not getting to the root cause. Whereas the Buddha himself, he didn't start out to start a religion, because that word didn't even exist in Sanskrit. He had his awakening, and then first thing he addressed was not a leap of faith, believe in me, I'm omniscient, or believe in God or karma, but just here's the reality of suffering. And then when he turned to the root of suffering, he didn't go metaphysical or transcendent or spiritual or anything like that. He said the roots of suffering are phenomena within the natural world, and we can't explore them. And then in terms of finding such liberation from suffering, setting out on the path, that's where samadhi really comes into play. Because prior to the Buddha, prior to 2,600 years ago, samadhi, developing these extremely subtle, profound, abstracted states of consciousness in which your awareness is completely removed from the physical world, your body, your human mind. It was taken as an end in itself, as kind of a moksha or liberation, by escaping from reality or escaping to a subtler reality. And Gautama, as a young prince at the age of 35, being the prodigy that he was, he's famous for very good reason, he achieved those same states of samadhi, and he had the perspicacity to recognize, yeah, this is a great vacation from this world here, but it doesn't actually get to the root of anything. And so he took samadhi, or you use the term shamatha, methods of great attentional refinement, and then combined these with inquiry, contemplative inquiry, rigorous, rational, empirical, and discovered that there are multiple dimensions of consciousness. And the most superficial is the whole range of mental phenomena that clearly do arise independent upon the body. I'm using my words carefully here. Is there any brain science in Buddhism? No, and I don't think there's any brain science in any of the great religious or contemplative traditions of the world. So give credit where credit is due. If you want to know about the brain, don't ask Buddhists, unless they happen to be Buddhist neuroscientists. And so tremendous advantages over the last 50 years or so in studying the brain and understanding the neurocorrelates to a wide and increasingly wide range of mental processes, states of consciousness, and so forth. Interesting work being done in psychedelics. How does that influence consciousness? So that's good. But in terms of actually fathoming the nature of consciousness, we go back the old-fashioned way, and that is observe it with all the precision, the acuity, the rigor you possibly can. And so what's been discovered here, and I will offer this not as religious propositions or as philosophical speculations, assertions that have been tested, can be tested, should be tested in full collaboration with the scientific community, people like yourself. And that is beyond the bandwidth, so to speak, of the human mind, where emotions, thoughts, desires, perceptions, memories, and so forth do arise clearly, and I will say in the 21st century, independent upon very specific neurocorrelates, about which you get no information from Buddhism, but Buddhists have always accepted from the time of the Buddha that this human mind arises independent upon the body, injure the body, damage the body, let the body be ill, or the body or the brain suffer from senile dementia or Alzheimer's, which have been around for a long time, or brain injury, and your mind will suffer. And you can actually shut it down. The more you damage the brain, the more the mind shuts down. So that's all good science, and it's also been affirmed by Buddhists from the beginning. But then we can ask a question for which there's no scientific answer. The question, yeah, but no answer. what are the natural causes and conditions that give rise to the emergence of consciousness, being aware, experiencing in a human fetus? They've studied very carefully, with great insight, the formation of the nervous system, the brain, the formation of the visual cortex, the auditory cortices, and so forth. It's great science. But they don't have an exploration. How did the brain ever become conscious? How did human beings ever become conscious? Frankly, they don't have a clue. They can't measure it, they can't define it, they don't know where it comes from. And so therefore, the notion that, well, of course, scientifically we know that when you die, your consciousness just becomes non-existent. That's often touted as scientific truth, an unquestioned scientific truth. And all that is an expression of uncritical faith, blind faith in materialism. Because if you don't know what causes consciousness, you don't have a clue what brings it to an end. It's just belief, akin to religious belief, which is all very fine, but it should never be touted as science. So Buddhist approach here, rooted in the maybe 2,000 years or so of contemplative research in samadhi prior to the Buddha. Yogis who spend 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and I've trained under some people of that caliber, meditating for years and years and years, that puts, full-time astronomers to shame. Like, boy, you're such slackers. You only work 12, 14 hours a day. These yogis, 16 hours a day for years on end, have penetrated through the bandwidth, the spectrum of subjective experience that clearly does arise independence upon the brain, that's influenced by the brain, but reciprocally, very, very importantly, influences the brain, the placebo effect, and so many other aspects of our emotions, our thoughts, desires, and so forth, have clear, measurable biological impact on the brain, the immune system, the heart, and so forth. It's a scientific fact that the causality is two-way. The mind is not just what the brain does, there's causality and it's interactive. But cutting through that and asking, from what did the human mind emerge? Because I'm 70, so my mind, Alan Wallace's mind, didn't exist 72 years ago. Not anywhere in the universe. It did not exist. Because it arose independence upon the brain that formed, when my body was still a fetus. And then what happens to consciousness, what actually does happen, something is true, happens at death. And to simply believe that you'll go to heaven or hell, or you'll be reborn, or that you become a non-entity, that's all very well, but that's just belief is cheap. Belief is cheap. Anybody can believe anything, and pretty much people do. But to actually have knowledge, that's much, much harder. And the key here is not studying more about the brain, because the brain will only tell you about subjective experience correlated to the brain, but when the brain shuts down, it goes dead, story's over. The brain scientist is now out of work. Because now you're looking at fertilizers. If you want to become a fertilizer scientist, you can shift job from a brain scientist to a fertilizer scientist. You can tell us a lot about the fertilizer that the brain becomes, but you'll learn nothing about consciousness. And so the discovery that's been made, replicated countless times, but never fully in collaboration with scientists, open-minded but very rigorous and skeptical scientists, is, does the human mind at death simply go into nothing, or does it dissolve back into, melt into a more primal flow of consciousness? And likewise, the emergence of the human mind sometime after conception, and I don't pretend to know when, but clearly not before conception, maybe at conception, like Roman Catholics believe that's when the soul is a human soul, as soon as the egg is fertilized. But to replace belief and conjecture and religious faith and philosophical speculation with actual knowledge, well, this is what contemplatives have done. And they found that there is an underlying continuum of consciousness that is individuated, it's not a collective unconscious. And it is a repository of our memories and our habitual propensities, character traits, and so forth, carried on from the past that will carry on to the future. That will first glance, of course, like, well, you're a Buddhist, that's what you have to say. You believe in Buddhism, that you have to believe that. I don't have to believe in anything. I really don't have to believe in anything. There's no evidence. Why should I believe it? And I wasn't born as a Buddhist. I've come to this conclusion with a scientifically trained mind, And I was planning to be a scientist from the time I was 13. So that way of thinking is not alien to me. This is a testable hypothesis. And I think I'm familiar with all of the materialistic hypotheses about the nature of consciousness, including that of my colleague, and I would say my friend, Christoph Koch, and I believe you've interviewed him. And I know his work of his colleague, Giulio Tononi. And I respect Christoph very much. We had an 11-hour conversation years ago, about 10 years ago, when he invited me to Caltech. Straight, we talked right through lunch. And I found him warm-hearted and open, and critical. He has his own beliefs, which are very different from mine, but we had a meaningful and fruitful conversation. But even this, I think, maybe the most sophisticated materialistic understanding of consciousness starts with a leap of faith. And that all you have to do is assert that if you have a physical system with integrated information, that corresponds to the amount of consciousness in that system. If you believe that, then you can roll the machine and you can get all kinds of conclusions. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that a system that has integrated information somehow is therefore conscious? And the answer is there isn't any. But if you make that leap of faith, then you can be an advocate of integrated information theory.
Yeah.
But I've just never been good at leaps of faith. And so in the Buddhist inquiry, you don't have to make any leap of faith. You have to have an open mind and then investigate for yourself. It comes down to a very simple empirical question. That is, you'll know as a neuroscientist. You are a neuroscientist, I'm correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to make sure. How many times have you heard this? Memories are encoded in the brain.
Yeah, that's definitely seen as a truth in neuroscience. Unquestioned truth. And there is evidence behind that. And that is if you stimulate certain ganglia of neurons, and memory may pop up, damage or eradicate, excise a ganglia of neurons, you may lose a memory. You may get it back due to neuroplasticity, but clearly there are correlations between specific configurations of neuron synapses and specific memories. That's good science. That's very good science. Now, what exactly does a memory, when you have a memory of your mother's face, the memory of your mother's face, the color of her hair, her complexion, her eyes, and so forth, clearly that the imagery that comes to mind when you think of your mother's face, that imagery, the mental images, are not physical. They can't be measured physically. They have no physical attributes. They're not located in physical space. They're not physical. So what on earth does it actually mean to say that something non-physical is encoded in something physical? Is E equals mc squared, was that encoded in some part of Einstein's brain? And his differential equation for general relativity was actually located in some part of his brain? It's a categorical error. But it's a reasonable hypothesis because of the correlations. And so there's a hypothesis. It's not, conclusive evidence, but it's reasonable. And the Buddha said, yeah, that's reasonable, except you've got a categorical error. How do you encode something non-physical in something physical? That doesn't really make any sense. And in laws of physics, which I have studied, there's no branch of physics that allows for non-physical phenomena, like the mental image of your mother's face, to emerge from physical phenomena. Physical phenomena of all kinds have emergent properties, but all the emergent properties of physical phenomena are emergent properties. They don't give rise to non-physics. That would go into pseudophysics or science fiction. But the memory of your mother's face or your memories are not physical. So then we can ask, if they're not encoded in the brain, if they're not stored in the brain, actually located in the physical space of your brain, then where are they located? And the Buddhist answer is, they're located in this primal flow of consciousness that carries on from lifetime to lifetime. And a way to test that is to go into deep samadhi, specifically achieve shamatha, go into this, let your mind, your human mind, dissolve into this underlying, very clear, cognizant, luminous flow of consciousness called the substrate consciousness, and go there. And once you have, and it can take months or years of very rigorous training, very demanding, in which your physical senses entirely implode, your mind totally calms down, but you go into a deeper, sharper and sharper state of clarity, luminosity, brightness, and acuity of awareness. So it's nothing like a trance. And you can't get this with drugs, LSD, you name it. It will not give rise to this. There's no shortcut or cheap trick like taking a drug that can bring you into a very, very deep state of samadhi. It's technology. It's a contemplative technology. And once you are there, and this has been done many, many times, now you are in the actual hard drive of the mind. The brain is like a keyboard, but the hard drive of the mind is the substrate consciousness. Buddhist hypothesis, let's just treat it as hypothesis, not a philosophical conjecture or a religious belief, oh, you have to believe because Buddha said so. Nonsense. If memories are stored there, not in the brain, but if you damage your keyboard enough, you'll lose you'll not access to a lot of your memories, right? The hard drive is still intact. If you damage your keyboard, pour coffee all over it, then you may not have access to your software. You may lose a lot of. That is, you can't see them appear on the screen. They won't manifest in behavior, and behavior is the screen. Brain is the keyboard.
the substrate consciousness hard drive. And so if memories are in fact not stored in the brain or encoded in the brain, but are correlated with very specific neuronal activities and functions, places in the brain, then a way of testing that would be to go into this profound state of samadhi and see if you can retrieve, first of all, kind of like a preparation. See if you can retrieve memories from a very early childhood. So if you're 40, for example, can you retrieve a memory you couldn't possibly recall in your normal waking state? Like, what did you have for breakfast this day 20 years ago? I think the chances are 0, right? Unless you have the same breakfast every day. And so this has been done. See if you can retrieve memories when you're in this deep state of samadhi that you cannot possibly retrieve in the ordinary waking state. And if it turns out that you can, and they've been doing this for at least 1,500 to 2,000 years in the Buddhist tradition, then see, so I'm just gonna say, let's imagine you're 40. All right, what do you recall on this day, September 14, 42 years ago? And of course, if you ran this experiment, you might come out, you go into deep samadhi, you come out, I'm the scientist, and say, James, what do you recall from 42 years ago, this day? And you come up and say, I got no data, I got nothing, I got a blank screen. And that's very possible. In which case, check one up for the materialists, they may be right. On the other hand, you could go into that samadhi and come out and you could say something silly, like I was Cleopatra. Like I'm just giving you something that can't possibly be true, right? But we know memory can be very creative and we can remember all kinds of things that never happened. And we forget most of the things that do happen. So you could come up with something that's complete fiction, no doubt about that. And it might even sound plausible, but it can be complete fiction. But it's also possible you might go in, focus the laser pointer of your samadhi on this day 42 years ago and have memories come up and you report them. And what if they're veridical? What if they can be tested? That you were an old man, 42 years old, who lived in Copenhagen and your wife died 3 years ago and you tell the address and who your daughter is and she takes care of you. What was your job? Who are your colleagues? And what if it turns out to be all true? The scientists, an open-minded scientist would be interesting, but maybe this is a scam. Maybe this, you poor Buddhists are trying to prove yourself right and you're trying to trick us. And then the scientists would come in. If this were done in a scientific context, okay, you came up with a lot of true answers, but this could be all a scam to try to, trick us here. So the scientists would go back and they would do their own background research on this individual who did exist. And they would ask relatives and friends and employees and colleagues and so forth, and they would come up with a ton of information about this man and his childhood and so forth. And they'd come back and say, okay, Mr. Yogi James, good start. But if this is a conspiracy, if you're trying to fool us here, answer this question. How many stones were there on the wedding ring you gave to your wife? How many stones were there? Where do you buy it? If this is you can't prepare for every possible question. No way. And so this is actually a testable hypothesis. When I've looked at all the other materialistic hypotheses, from the integrated information theory, the mind is the brain, the mind is a function of the brain, the mind's an emergent property of the brain, and so on, what I found is not a single one is actually empirically testable. They all start with the leap of faith that you can't test. So I find here, the materialists look like more true religious believers, and the really open-minded, rigorous contemplative looks like the real scientist on the block. So what I'm looking forward to is, and we're doing this now, we're just beginning in Crestone, Colorado, in the United States. We have now created and we're developing a Center for Contemplative Research, which is precisely designed to bring to mind open-minded, professionally trained contemplatives with open mind, professionally trained scientists and say, look, you brain scientists, psychologists, you know a lot that we don't know. And the physicists, you know a lot that we don't know. But we, allegedly, we know a lot about consciousness that you don't know. So let's see if we can learn from each other and not have Buddhists win or the materialists win. Let's everybody win who's really keen on understanding what is the truth about the nature, the origins, the multiple dimensions of the mind. And now I'll say very, very briefly, you used the Tibetan term Rigpa. And this is, according to many, many contemplatives in the Buddhist tradition, and I think elsewhere, this is the deepest dimension of consciousness, the deepest dimension that is beyond any individuated stream of consciousness from lifetime to lifetime. It is a dimension truly transcends every conceptual construct. It's atemporal and non-local, but it is knowable. It is knowable. And there are methods, and I've been teaching them for about 30 years by now, and studying and practicing them for longer than that, to actually realize this deepest dimension of consciousness, known by many names. And I don't think Buddhists have a monopoly on this. I think this has been accessed by great Christian contemplatives and Sufis and so forth, but that too is an empirical claim, not just, oh, it must be true, Alan Wallace said so. I hope nobody thinks that. So testable. So rather long answer, but to a very, very important question. I'm just eager to see rigorous contemplatives and scientists coming together to learn from each other. So we move beyond the phase thus far of scientists coming in and studying the brains and behaviors of meditators, and the scientists publish all the results, and they get all the credits, and the meditators, we never even learn who they are. That's not a collaboration any more than a guinea pig collaborates with a biologist when a study is done of guinea pigs.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I think yeah, absolutely. If we give the meditators their credit and we turn our attention to the experiential side, something that I think with the Tibetan tradition, or at least I guess Mahayana Buddhism, as opposed to Theravada, is seems to have this this understanding of certain aspects of consciousness as it's felt in the present moment. There's very nuanced, very accurate, in my opinion. And as I mentioned, the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, reading about the Dzogchen teachings, that to me just was, I've not read in all of my studies of psychology and neuroscience, the rest of Buddhism as well, I've not found anything that was so clear. You have certain traditions like Zen, which might kind of shrug its shoulders and say, don't get us to describe what's going on. It can't be put into words. But then the Tibetans seem to do a very good job of putting it into words. So yeah, maybe that's where we can go next, is thinking about the what it is, the kind of that's pointed out in these Dzogchen teachings about the nature of the mind.
Yeah. So the Dzogchen is really, and this is what I've been totally focused on for the last 30 years. My own practice, study, translation, teaching, writing, that's been, and then interfacing with science, that certainly has been important. But for my practice, it's really Dzogchen. So the first book on Tibetan Buddhism I ever picked up was this one, the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, summer of 1970. But very rapidly, when I went to India, Dharamsala, India, in 1971, I came under the tutelage of the Dalai Lama. I met him in the fall of 1971, knew he was my spiritual mentor. He's been guiding me ever since. And he saw to it that for the next 19 years or so, he really guided me in such a way as to lay a foundation for the study of Dzogchen. Studying Dzogchen is like starting with quantum cosmology, or starting with the most sophisticated branch of any science. And I knew when I decided to go back to Amherst College and study physics, I was fascinated by quantum mechanics. But I said, I don't want to be a new ager here. And so I went back, and after 14-year hiatus from Western academia, studied calculus all over again, and mechanics, and electromagnetism, and relativity theory, and quantum mechanics. I earned my way there. So when I encountered the Schrödinger wave equation, I could actually understand it and use it. And so similarly, that's what the Dalai Lama did for me. My first love was Dzogchen. But the first Dzogchen teachings I ever received were actually from him when I was a graduate student at Stanford in 1989. And he taught right nearby, taught Dzogchen, and that's the first Dzogchen teachings I've ever received. And so finally then, I was 39 years of age at that time. Okay, then he saw, okay, now you're ready to go. And that's what I'm focusing on ever since. So the central theme in Dzogchen, which means the great perfection, and it's regarded by many, and it seems like you're one of them and I'm one of them, is really the pinnacle of Buddhist theory and practice that makes everything else make sense. Theravada, Chan, Zen, Indian Buddhism, and Vajrayana Buddhism, everything actually makes sense. It really strikes me, just now my subjective impression, it strikes me as like climbing to the top of Mount Everest. And from there you can look down on all the other mountains. And hypothetically, you could see the oceans and the valleys and so forth. Of course, you can't in reality, but you come to the highest place and everything else you can see from the highest. Whereas from your lower, you can't necessarily see the higher. And that's my conclusion I've drawn after having studied and practiced it for 30 years. And it's fundamentally about realizing the nature of the mind all the way down to its fundamental ground. And it turns out to be the very ground of being, called primordial consciousness, pristine awareness. It's called Buddha nature. It goes by many names. And to give an analogy, I think it's a very powerful one. if you're in the midst of what you're dreaming, but you don't know you're dreaming. So a person who is awake and maybe monitoring your galvanic skin response, rapid eye movement, and so forth, will know you're dreaming. And from that person's perspective, you're having a non-lucid dream because you don't know you're dreaming. In the midst of a non-lucid dream, you could do all kinds of amazing things if it were a not long enough dream, right? Maybe you could get a PhD in neuroscience. Maybe you could practice and develop great samadhi. Perhaps you could study Madhyamaka and gain very profound insight into the emptiness of inherent nature of everything you're experiencing, that everything you're experiencing objectively isn't there from its own side, inherently objective, and everything you're experiencing subjectively is not inherently from in here. And in fact, the very split between subject and object is conventional, just like the border between England and Scotland, but it's not really there. So you could even have such insight. Maybe you could develop paranormal abilities, in the dream by your profound insight and still not know you're dreaming, right? Still not know you're dreaming. Whereas another person in the dream might, and this has happened, might encounter in the dream a person who says, "Hey, James, you know you're dreaming?" And that, like the great story of Tilopa smacking his student Naropa with a sandal and snapping him out of his non-lucidity in the waking state and cut through to becoming lucid in the waking state, likewise in a dream. When I had my first non-lucid dreams, it was always not because of training in lucid dreaming and following Stephen LaBerge and so forth. He and I were colleagues at Stanford back in the early 1990s. We did a number of workshops together. But I didn't have my first lucid dreams by training in his very, very excellent methods, but just by seeing anomalies in the dream and knowing this is a dream, this can't be true. I won't give the details of it, but for many people, that's just a dream-induced lucid dream, because anomaly so weird happens in the dream, it can't possibly be waking state. And so if you become lucid in that one instant, like a sudden awakening, but not waking up from the dream, awaking within the dream, in that instant of recognizing, oh, this is a dream, now you're suddenly free. And I've known some very, very adept lucid dreamers over the years. I'll give you one example. A Norwegian woman, very gifted, had many, many lucid dreams. And she told me of a lucid dream in which, while lucid, a big thug, big chunky guy, strong guy came to her with a big knife. And he was very threatening. But she was lucid. And so she walked up to this guy who seemed like he wanted to stab her, took his hands with a knife in it into her hands, and she thrust this big blade into her guts. She disarmed him by putting the blade into her guts in the dream. And I asked her, did that hurt? And she said, no, it was a dream knife. And a dream knife doesn't have any molecules in it. It's not made of metal. It's a dream knife into dream guts. And so in her lucid dreams, of which she had many, she was fearless. And if you've had any lucid dreams yourself, then you know one of the easiest things to do in a lucid dream is fly. It's really, really easy. Just basically think you can, and you can. And with a bit of training, you can start walking through walls. And if you wanted to turn water into wine, if you wanted to walk on water, perform all kinds of miracles, you don't need to train in samadhi or gain this side, insight. All you need to do is wake up. And in that instant that you're awake, and to the extent that you are lucid, because you can be a little bit lucid or thoroughly lucid, but the more lucid you are, then you are awake within the dream, and you are fearless. You have all kinds of what look like paranormal abilities to other people in the dream. They say, wow, look, he flew through the air, and so forth and so on. And so among all the things you could do within a non-lucid dream, none of them collectively add up to the insight and the abilities that can come from that one insight of becoming lucid. And that's the theme in Dzogchen. The Buddha was once asked by a person who tracked him, and he saw him. Apparently he's quite dazzled by the Buddha's sheer physical presence. Very impressive individual. And they asked him, are you a god? He said, no. Are you an angelic being? He said, no. Are you a primal force like a nature spirit? He said, no. And then he asked him, are you a man? And the Buddha said, no. And then he asked him, then what are you? And he said, I'm awake. And if you're having a non-lucid dream and you're performing all kinds of cool miracles, flying and shape changing and doing all kinds of very cool stuff, and somebody saw you with your marvelous beard and your radiating light and so forth in this dream and said, James, are you a god? And so forth. In honesty, you say, no, I'm not a god. Sorry to disappoint. But this person asking the question from the perspective of thinking he's really in this dream, that he's really here. And he asks, I'm a man. James, are you a man? Basically, are you like me? You'd have to say, no, I don't have parents like you think you have parents. No, I don't fit within your gestalt, within your worldview. I don't fit here. So no, I'm not like you. You're a non-lucid person thinking you're a person, a man, and I'm lucid. So no, I don't identify with this human form that you see. And therefore I'm awake. So the whole of Dzogchen, now to wrap this up, the whole of Dzogchen is all about one thing: to wake up in what we presume to be the waking state already, and wake up to the actual nature of reality, which is to view this reality we're experiencing right now. You're presumably gazing at your laptop, your desktop, you're seeing your room and so forth, viewing this not from the perspective of James Cook, but from the perspective, viewing the same appearances from the perspective of pristine awareness, which is by nature awake. So it's all about that. And from that one realization of cutting through and viewing reality from this ground state, this grounded being, then everything makes sense. And you are fearless and you are free by that one insight.
I love the analogy of the kind of looking out from the mountaintop, because I think you're right that in the kind of Dzogchen teachings, right, you'll read a lot about describing the mind as kind of empty or clear and luminous and kind of aware and all of these adjectives. But there seems to be less of a lot of other Buddhist traditions. There's a huge emphasis on the self being an illusion or not what we think it is, which is part of, I think, with this view, it's there, but you almost don't need to state it, because once you see that the mind is this luminous sphere of just awake, empty phenomena, well, the self is another one of those empty phenomena. It's kind of, you almost don't even need to mention it, right? It's just, there's just this sphere of awareness, experientially, sphere of awareness, and it's all just self-illuminating. And yeah, I mean, to me, this is just such a clear description of the nature of our mind in every moment. And it needs to be better understood, I think, especially in kind of Western kind of thinking about the nature of the mind. And so with the, you mentioned the kind of pointing out instructions, which is how this is often taught, right? And I think because it's the nature of your mind in every moment, it can just be pointed out, I guess, and you can return to it. Is that how you practice? You kind of return to the insight repeatedly?
Yeah, you made a very important point at the very beginning of introducing this topic of Dzogchen and the Great Perfection. And that is, it's universally stated throughout all the Dzogchen literature. I haven't read all of it, but I have a good sampling. It's ineffable. Pristine awareness, primordial, is ineffable, inconceivable, transcends word, transcends anything you can possibly think. And yet there are thousands upon thousands of pages written about it, and thousands of hours of teachings, verbal teachings that are given. So what's up with that? And there's a very good answer to this. And that is, there are two fundamental uses of language. And so let's imagine you want to know about Paris. Let's imagine you've never been to Paris. Or no, let's say you have been. How about the Gobi? You ever been to the Gobi?
No.
Gobi Desert? Okay, that's a better example then. So I've been there. My wife is really quite an expert on Mongolian culture and Buddhism. And so she took me there years ago. And so if you'd like to know about the Gobi, then I can describe it to you. I've had a good sampling. And I can describe the color of the earth and how the mountains, the nature of the desert, how big it is and so forth. I could give you a very good description of what it's like, just in words. And all the words I would say would be very meaningful to you, and you'd have some idea, okay, this guy's been to the Gobi, he knows what it's like. And so that use of language is called descriptive. It's not the same thing in the Gobi, but now that I've described it, if you travel around the world, you might recognize it when you're there. because of my description of it, you know. But I didn't give you a clue how to get there. I've been there, I describe it, but you have no idea how do you go from London to the Gobi. Well, you have no idea by my using language descriptively, although I gave you an accurate description as much as words can do so. On the other hand, I could say, James, the Gobi is really, if you spent your whole life in England and didn't know about the Sahara and the Mojave Desert and so forth and so on, I'd say, you know, and you just don't know about deserts, I'd say, James, there's just nothing based on England, Wales, or Scotland, or North Ireland that would give you any idea. And so I can't describe it to you. It's just outside of your scope. Never known anything, you know, like medieval English people didn't know anything about outside of England, you know. So there's just no way. It's a whole lot of seashore with a lot of sand. That's not going to really cut it, you know. That doesn't capture. But what I can do then is use language instrumentally. Say, James, if you'd like to know Gobi and you've never been outside of the United Kingdom, here's what you do, and I give you directions. I give you directions. And then you follow all the directions, and lo and behold, there you see the Gobi for yourself, without my ever having described it. And so I would say that all of the thousands upon thousands of pages of written material and of teachings are all instrumental, because the Gobi can be described. I could say, you know, you've been to the seashore, you know, on the West Coast in Cornwall. Okay, imagine a whole lot of that, you know. So I could kind of give you some idea, because it's, you know, clearly within the scope of language and concepts. But pristine awareness by its very nature is inconceivable, ineffable, but all the teachings are instrumental, and they're all, to use a Buddhist analogy, fingers pointing to the moon. So if you just stare at the finger and try to gaze at it and look at the finger, you'll never know what it's talking about. But if you follow the line of sight, then it will point you in the right direction. And that's why they're called pointing out instructions. They point to you, something that is hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight. But we're so caught up in our concepts, our beliefs, our language, and so forth, that we can't see what's right there, evident. And you made a very important point, and that is, you know, in the foundational teachings of the Buddha, not self, not self. Your body is not a self, mind is not a self, not self, empty of self. And it's true, and it's good. And neuroscientists corroborate that. There's no neurocorrelate for the self. No neurocorrelate for mental consciousness, for that matter. And then in the Mahayana teachings, the perfection of wisdom, teachings on emptiness, all phenomena are empty of inherent nature. They don't really exist by their own side, objectively or subjectively. Well, that's also true. There's corroboration for that from quantum mechanics. And some very astute philosophers like Hilary Putnam, with his, you know, the late Hilary Putnam at Harvard for many years. But if you have that one insight, as you just suggested, that one insight, you cut through and you're actually viewing reality, and that includes your body, your mind, the environment, other people, from that perspective, then you don't even need to say, of course, hey, James, your body is not you. Like, why would anybody think that from this perspective? Of course. And they say, hey, James, although phenomena appears from their own side, they're not really there. Say, yeah, of course. Just if you were in a lucid dream, and you know this is a dream, you don't need to be told, hey, those mountains over there, you know they're not really there, they don't exist. Say, I know it's a dream, I got it. We don't need to linger there on the emptiness of an individual self, of a person, or the emptiness of inherent nature of other phenomena, because with that one insight, you get a bounty that'll all flow spontaneously out of that. So I think there are very good reasons why this is considered to be the pinnacle of Buddhist thought and practice, and very timely that it's really only within the last 50 years or so that this whole tradition of Dzogchen, which is really so deeply embedded in Tibetan Buddhism, and before that, you know, Buddhism in India with the Mahamudra tradition and so on. It's only within the last 50 years that this Dzogchen tradition, maybe starting with Evan Wentz's book, you know, Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. I don't know that there's anything on Dzogchen in English before then. Don't think so. That it's coming to not just Europe or America, but modern world, only in this phase of human history. This phase of human history. And the prophecies, and we take them with a grain of salt or believe them, whatever, but the prophecies are that this Dzogchen, this whole matrix of theory and practice, will be most powerful when times are most degenerate. Most degenerate. And I think I have some intuition why that may be the case. But the fact is, it just recently come on the world stage, but it disappeared from India. It never really took, it was in China and disappeared from China. There was really only one culture on the planet that preserved this tradition, and that was Tibet and its immediately adjacent countries like Bhutan, northern India, Ladakh, and so on. So I think something's really afoot here, something of tremendous significance and very timely, that highly trained scientists, and I know some of them, physicists, they really resonate. And these are not Buddhist, but they read about Dzogchen and they say, oh, there's something deep there. Can we learn more about this? So I think the best is yet to come, because this type of research putting together is just barely beginning now.
Yeah, and I think something you kind of described this as, you mentioned kind of having to dispel illusion and delusion to get this view. Something that's a kind of a challenge with this is, as you pointed out, that in this perspective, this is the nature of the mind in every moment, right? In its kind of deep level, it's the mind is already enlightened. You know, it's not something you create, or you know, you have this thing you might call Buddha nature. And I think, yeah, with these teachings, it's once it's noticed, it's so obvious and simple, and it's almost like how did I ever overlook that? It's the most clear, obvious. It's just like shining like a diamond, like right in the middle of every moment. But our minds have evolved to be these kind of distracted things, and we don't notice it. So there's something, I think, with this tradition, it's great that you can simultaneously directly describe to people the nature of the mind, point it out, and for those of them who just get it, great, like, and then they can return to it. But as you said, that for you there was 2 decades of practicing, building up to this point, and so there's this strange kind of, I hesitate to say a paradox, but it's kind of like you have to, you know, it's right here, right now, but we're overlooking it, and so we have to do something to get back to here. You know, it's kind of strange, but I think for anyone listening who wants to learn this, they can't just go out and do, you know, get pointing out instructions from anyone, right? It's something where there are lots of preliminary practices in the Tibetan tradition. And do you think kind of, I guess you also talk about, you know, Vipassana meditation, and is that kind of good preliminary practices, just kind of the more kind of widely available standard kind of meditative training before someone, you know, attempts to seek out these higher teachings?
And yeah, I think it's a very nuanced question, because on the one hand, as in music, there are prodigies. Mozart composing symphonies when he's 8 years old, something like that. Prodigies in music, prodigies in mathematics, prodigies in science, prodigies in chess, and so on and so on. There are exceptional individuals. And from a Buddhist perspective, yeah, we'd say, yeah, it's not just their genes that make them composing symphonies when they're 8 years old, because you know, Mozart's parents were not geniuses, and often geniuses have pretty ordinary parents. So I don't think there's much explanatory power in trying to explain everything in terms of genes. To some extent, but it really falls short. And the Buddhist view is, yeah, if you have a genius, this is because you came in with a tremendous amount of momentum. As Plato says, you know, in his theory of reincarnation, so much we know, it's just recalling things we knew in the past or drawing from past momentum. And so in contemplative inquiry, in spirituality, there are geniuses as well. There are prodigies. And they're very rare. Many of us would like to think we are such, but most of us aren't. I'm not. So there are individuals that they can come in with hardly any foundational training, or there are people like Jakob Böhme in the Christian tradition, who I think he was a shoemaker or something like that, a very mundane trade. But he had these natural breakthroughs. And I will not say they're equivalent to Rigpa, but clearly had some very profound breakthrough insights in the nature of reality that I take very seriously. But it wasn't coming from years and years of monastic training, contemplative training, rigorous asceticism, and so forth. So this is true. I mean, this is true in the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist, Christian, and so on. But for the rest of us who are not these, you know, 1 in 10 million kind of prodigies, then there is a path. There is a step-by-step path. And it starts, I can really make it very, very concise. It starts with ethics. With no ethics, forget about it. You know, there is no foundation without ethics. And it's fundamentally nonviolence and benevolence, that we treat ourselves, other species, the environment with nonviolence above all. And we're not doing that, we're doing the opposite as a civilization. And with benevolence, when we see we can be of benefit, then we do our best to do so. On that basis, then there's the training in samadhi. And this is samadhi is not just training single-pointed attention, like a world-class chess player or a sniper or a jet fighter pilot. This is the contemplatively trained deep samadhi that can be sustained single-pointedly for hours or even days on end. And no jet fighter pilot can do that. And what it is cultivating exceptional levels of mental balance, mental refinement, honing, refining, developing, and cultivating the mind so that you can use it like a laser. You start out with, in English, you'd say, British English, a torch. So out of a torch, you can light a room with a torch. But saying that, take that same kind of light and give it a lot more energy and homogenize it and tightly focus it, you got yourself a paranormal light, which you call a laser. Samadhi is a laser of consciousness. So we all have consciousness, but very few people have turned their flashlight or their torch into a laser. And to really have very profound and liberating, irreversibly liberating insights that radically and irreversibly transform, you can't skip samadhi. You can't have just a glimpse and have it turned into a memory and think that's going to bring about some absolutely radical change in your whole being. So samadhi is a way of making the insights sustainable, that they actually permeate every aspect of your being. And on that basis of shamatha, which is true for all, it's common, it's found in all Buddhist tradition, starting with early Buddhism, Theravada, and so forth. Then on that basis, then you have vipassana. And there's a wide variety of methods, just like you can't say, well, what's the scientific method when it comes to physics? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Which branch of physics, which kind of technology, and so forth. And so there's a wide variety of methods of vipassana, but they all entail not just bare attention. That's really dumbing it down an awful lot. It's very rigorous modes of inquiry, empowered with samadhi. So like the samadhi is a telescope, and vipassana is actually conducting astronomical research. And that will give you insight into the absence, the emptiness of inherently existent ego, separate, autonomous. You'll see that for yourself. Extend it, and you'll see that you have insight into the emptiness of all phenomena, which is getting pretty close to the insights of quantum mechanics, but actually experiencing it. And on the basis of those two, and then there's a crucial point that's easily left out. And it will sound like it's coming from left field. We say in baseball terminology, just out of the blue. But as for Dzogchen, as for all of Vajrayana, all of Mahayana practice, motivation is enormously important. Motivation. Because people can have all kinds of motivation for science, including wanting to just be wealthy or be famous or develop a weapon of mass destruction and so on. And that's true for the arts, it's true for literature. Motivations differ an awful lot. But for Dzogchen, given the nature of the inquiry, the only suitable motivation is universally stated, is a motivation, the aspiration to achieve the highest possible spiritual awakening, the perfection of wisdom, of compassion, in order to be of greatest service to the world. So it has to be rooted in benevolence, altruism. It's called bodhicitta, the mind of awakening. But that is crucial. That's the only motivation that's actually where the foot fits the shoe, that it's in complete sync. So with that motivation, the samadhi, the vipassana, is marvelously benevolent motivation of altruism to achieve awakening for the benefit of all creatures. With that kind of preparation, then to be introduced to the view. And it can be by pointing out instructors, it can be verbal, but for some people it can be anomalies, or it can be just by going deep into meditation yourself, having received the instruction, and you'll deliver it yourself, the pointing out instructions. You'll have your own internal breakthrough. And so that kind of preparation for the prodigies, simply by realizing Rigpa, this bodhicitta arises spontaneously and effortlessly. You don't need to cultivate it. Insight into emptiness of all phenomena, spontaneous. Insight into the egolessness, spontaneous. Samadhi, spontaneous. All from one. So that really is the pinnacle. But then one can say, well, then let's just all practice Dzogchen. But this would be by like taking a whole, a group of 5-year-old children who are just ready to enter, kindergarten, and saying, the highest branch of science is quantum cosmology. And I know you don't know how to add and subtract yet, but I'm just teach kids, I'm just going to teach you quantum cosmology because it's the highest thing there is. Well, they'll never learn quantum cosmology, and they'll never learn how to add and subtract either. And so for the prodigy, who knows, there are children. What was the last one? A 13-year-old, I think, had already earned his PhD, something like that. These prodigies come up. And yeah, there's one Indian master, Atisha, he was reading Sanskrit when he was 3 years old. and it's a tough language. So the prodigies, you know, they're unusual. But for the rest of us, there are these preparations so that we make ourselves ripe, or to use Buddhist terminology, we make of our minds a suitable vessel, so that when presented with the view, the meditation, the way of life of the great perfection, it goes in, we realize it, we embody it, and we're liberated.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned the kind of cultivation of compassion as well, because I think it's in the motivation to practicing this stuff, because we didn't mention before that I think that's a kind of a key aspect of the mind that's pointed out in these teachings as well. So, you know, if in your deepest nature you are awake or aware and the mind has this compassionate tone, if you're trying to get there without cultivating awareness and compassion, then you're just leaving certain blockages in the way, and it's just not a wise. You're not going to get there by leaving them there, I think. Yeah. Well, this has been really wonderful, and thank you so much for your time. If there's anywhere people want to go to kind of look into your work further, where would you direct them?
Oh, if you look my name, B. Alan Wallace, on Amazon, about 30 or 40 books will come up if you like to read. But what I find most thrilling is I'm not writing anymore. I figured 40 books is enough. I'm done. What I'm interested in the research, and the contemplative research above all. And so I've been striving for 13 years to create a center for contemplative research. And we have a little one, it's just a seed, but it started in Tuscany, Italy. And now we have 110 acres, or about 45 hectares in the state of Colorado, 8,000 feet elevation. And we have 11 cabins. We plan to build a lot more. And so it's centerforcontemplativeresearch.org, Center for Contemplative Research. And the institute I started 17 years ago, the Santa Barbara Institute, sbinstitute.com, shows the background for all of this. We've run or co-sponsored a number of really rather high-profile first-rate scientific studies, cultivating emotional balance. Goes back to the year 2000 with the very eminent psychologist Paul Ekman. And the Shamatha Project, which was initially my idea, going back 13 years. So the Santa Barbara Institute's been involved in some first-rate scientific research. But where I think the cutting edge is the kind of research we're anticipating at this incredibly beautiful site, a hermitage. It had been a Krishna hermitage for about 35 years, and they were very happy to sell it to us. Well, we'll bring together Dzogchen and methods for developing samadhi, and methods for developing vipassana, and for cultivating or unveiling our capacity for compassion. And we'll bring this together with first-rate research by psychologists, neuroscientists, physicists, and I think we may do something really groundbreaking here. And all that's required is not any leap of faith at all. Not a leap of faith into materialism, not a leap of faith into reincarnation or karma or God, but an open mind and a spirit of what William James called radical empiricism. Let's set all our assumptions aside. They may be valid, and then we'll hold on to them. But let's go in with a fresh mind, an open mind, and be willing to question all of our assumptions. And those that are true will wind up being seen to be truer, and those that are false will go the way of the dinosaurs. They'll just go extinct and become memories. So I think this is where the real juice is. And to end on a larger note, I think all of us, like yourself, myself, who are really concerned about the world and are intelligent, we're informed about the impact our 7.8 billion human beings are having on the planet. We know this has been building up for about 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, and it also has to be, and I think it's no coincidence, the rise of materialism, mid-19th century. That the effect on the environment is utterly catastrophic, and it's not slowing down. We burned more carbon fuel last year than ever before, and that's with the full knowledge that we're destroying the planet with global climate change. And so if we are to preserve human civilization through the rest of this century, because it is either to be gone or we will have solved the problem by the end of this century, it's that dramatic and that urgent. There needs to be a fundamental shift, and I have so much admiration for science and technology. My own life, the fact that we can have this conversation, benefits of scientific technology, and give the credit where credit is due. It's fantastic. But all the science and technology we have is enough to solve all the impact, all the detriment we're doing to the environment, and we're not taking advantage of it. And religion, there are religious leaders like the Pope, very conscientious, very wise, every comment he makes about the environment, socially responsible. Dalai Lama, keen advocate of environmental preservation, green. And yet, we're not paying attention. You know, billions of Christians not paying attention, Buddhists not doing that much damage, there aren't so many of us. If we are to save human civilization and save the planet for other species as well, we wiped out 40% of the wildlife in the last 50 years. Then there has to be something really deep, a fundamental paradigm shift in which we radically alter, revolutionize our very sense of who we are, role of humanity in the universe, and not with leaps of faith, but with a union of the best of science and the best, I believe, of contemplative inquiry, and see that the potentials of human mind, one could say, actually are literally infinitely vaster than anything we've envisioned in modern Eurocentric civilization. Potentials for awakening, for meaning, for liberation, for transformation are beyond anything we've possibly imagined in all of Western civilization. And it does not mean converting to Buddhism or converting to Dzogchen, but going deeper and deeper into our own heritage and finding that we have been sitting on treasures all along, hidden in plain sight and not noticed. So I believe we urgently need a fundamental paradigm shift that will identify and highlight the deepest common ground among the great contemplative traditions of the world, the Taoists, the Jewish, the Buddhists, and so forth, and go to the very depths, the cutting edge of modern science. And I think that is, in terms of the actual nature of reality itself, is not found in biology or chemistry. It really is found in the most cutting edge branches of modern physics, especially quantum mechanics. And with a fundamental shift on the whole way of viewing reality, having an impact on our values. What is of value? What can really bring us the kind of happiness and fulfillment we seek? And how can we optimally treat each other, the environment, other species? It has to be a very deep shift. And I think we're ripe for it. And I think Dzogchen may be a catalyst for that, to click this over and to advance science beyond our wildest dreams, advance contemplative inquiry beyond our wildest dreams, and flourish as we never have in all of recorded human history, flourish together, the Chinese and the Indians, the Europeans and the South Americans, Australians and so on. I think there is a very, very luminously bright future ahead if we can only see it's there. So that's my closing thought.
That's a wonderful, wonderful thing to close on. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity, James. Really privileged to speak with you.
Yeah, you too.